Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Schweitzer, and my co-instructor here today is Althea Wheeler. And we're just going to get started with some housekeeping as people start to join us here, and then we'll get into our presentation. We've designed this presentation to be approximately 50 minutes long. We'll be monitoring the chat and the question box throughout. So if you look at your panel, you should see a questions option and a chat option. So please feel free to put any questions that come to mind, or if you wish to have sort of a discussion on certain points, feel free to put that in the chat. So we'll be muting everyone up until about 10 minutes to the hour, and then we'll welcome to take up questions, or if you sort of want to further clarify, we can certainly unmute everyone and address things that way. So it's now about 12 o'clock, so I think we're going to get started. And if you can't see the screen or can't hear, please try and use the chat, and we'll try and attempt to troubleshoot. So as you can see here, this is the objectives of today's session. We're going to discuss the how to share, why to share, what sharing means, how to sort of how Creative Commons plays into sharing, and other licenses that you may not be aware of, and understand how licensing may influence publication choice. So just to get a conversation going here, we're just going to launch the first poll. So can everyone see that? Good. And so we're going to give you about maybe 5 seconds or so. Everyone's starting to answer. This is great. Okay, it looks like everyone's, oh, no, we still got a few people responding. Okay. And I think we're going to close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we're going to share the results here. So as you can see here, it's neck and neck between requests from other researchers and publisher policy as being the major motivators for data sharing, followed closely by a personal commitment to open data, which is great. And oh, I see I kind of missed just slightly, as I guess as a second place selection, dissemination and recognition of your work. So all very strong motivations. So we're going to hide this poll result now. And we're going to move to a summary of motivators that researchers expressed that was reported in the State of Open Data and commented on by Anna Lubitskaya here. So as you can see, most researchers like to make their data available, so similar to what was expressed in the poll just now, that seems to be largely true. And as countries and disciplines, and I will note this is 2017, or 2016 this was reported and commented on in 2017, so the State of Open Data is run every year, so it's kind of interesting to watch the trends change. But in the time that this was reported, highest awareness is in these countries, as you can see. Career and career stage doesn't necessarily equal awareness. So everyone, whether you're a grad student to early career researcher to PI, established PI, awareness seems to be about the same. And that the researchers like the attention for data gathering, which I think is reflected in that attribution comment that people made in the polls. And then in terms of the gaps, and this will be interesting to see whether this comes out in this presentation. Most people are unsure how to make their data open. They're not sure how to navigate the licenses, which I think is part of the reason why people are here today, and not sure about the obligations of sharing. So everyone is looking for more guidance. There's some confusion over data set citations, how to cite maybe sources of data for secondary use. And then there's you know, an open mind, largely as in these last two bullets here, people are starting to have a much more open mind, especially in COVID-19. I think the benefits of open data have become very apparent, and the, you know, the impetus around sharing has become very clear. So if you've never shared, most people have at least been pre-contemplative about sharing. So some interesting things to think about there. So around the how to share and how sharing actually works. For most researchers, this ecosystem is largely invisible. For those of us on the other sort of in the inner workings of this ecosystem, like librarians, like information scientists, like information technologists, we're busy building and this infrastructure, trying to make it work more efficiently. And thanks to COVID-19, actually, a lot of those fault lines are very readily apparent. And so we're madly working to try and make some of these fault lines disappear and reinforce some of these pipelines. So as you can see here, for example, in the top right under scholarly communication, registries, these play an important role in terms of connectors between the bottom left, which is the hybrid repositories, thematic repositories. So thematic being like either discipline specific or particular types of repositories like protocols IO. And then hybrid repositories, which can include sort of the larger generic repositories like Figshare, or also can include institutional repositories such as University of Manitoba's Dataverse and MSpace. And then also these other pieces here that are important in terms of making the data pipelines happen, or motivators for those pipelines, such as publishers and funders. And then in the top of the screen here, the software repositories, which are another type of repository that are particular and different from the hybrid and thematic repositories, and then the various infrastructures that are required to sort of make all of this sort of happen, organizations that provide policy or governance stipulations on infrastructure and those kinds of things. So you start to now see with this map, which is very, very helpful, how all of these things fit together. Because oftentimes we talk about all these things, and if you don't have a very great sense of sort of how to visualize it, you can get very, very lost very quickly. So why share? So I probably list the obvious here underneath here, but oftentimes the benefits of sharing kind of get lost in the barriers of sharing, which is a shame because the barriers of sharing can be largely overcome. So oftentimes people, there's a shared goal. So obviously with COVID-19, that becomes a collective imperative. Support innovation, which again, COVID-19 has definitely brought to bear. In terms of research integrity, transparency, not necessarily reproducibility, and these things unfortunately get put together, conflated, and they're not necessarily the same, because not all data can be reproducible, but that doesn't necessarily make it flawed or fraudulent. But if you aim towards transparency, then at least people can follow your the steps you took to how you got there, and if not necessarily reproducible, at least can respect those steps and critique them as they will. So, and then finally, in terms of research impact, it has been demonstrated over and again that the more access that people have, the more ready and able they are to cite it, include it, talk about it, modify it, add to it, those kinds of things. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get to in this age of COVID-19. So in terms of obligations to sharing, there's two large drivers, one of which is funder policy. And some of these funders are represented here. And Wellcome, for example, National Institutes of Health, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, those are very high profile funders that have policies that stipulate sharing. One of which that is not here is the Tri-Agencies of Canada funders. And one thing that has actually come about thanks to the COVID-19 grants is that there's actually a stipulation that you must deposit, which is a form of sharing. And we can talk about that later if you have any further questions. So the publishers here also can stipulate sharing, and a very popular example is PLOS. And sometimes if you're not in the position to share or have thought about it prior to publishing, the stipulation around sharing could really cause a lot of angst. So part of this presentation is to try and make sure that you're not in that position, that you are prepared, or you have researched what your options are around sharing, and you can make an informed decision. So the obligations for sharing, here's an example from a publisher. So this is Nature. This is Nature's statement on data sharing. And you can see here that authors are required to make materials, data, code, and associated protocols promptly available to readers without undue qualifications. So what does that actually mean? It means that within reason, materials that you have included in your manuscript should be deposited in, say, a repository in a way that people can reasonably access. If you have sensitive data, if you have data that has restrictions for sharing, you can provide that in a way that still enables some degree of compliance with this. And if you're not quite sure how, that is a question that we're able to help you navigate. A lot of times it comes down to data curation. And a lot of researchers are if you're not sort of prepared, it can really put you sort of on the back foot. And so we can help you navigate this. It's not as sort of like thou shalt provide everything type of statement. We can help you negotiate this kind of thing. So this is obligations of sharing from another type of publisher, which is PLOS. PLOS is a lot of times when researchers publish with PLOS, and maybe they're not familiar with this data availability statement, again, they're maybe feel a little ill prepared. And again, this goes back to exactly what I just said with regards to Nature. It's a matter of data curation. It's a matter of understanding what the vehicles of sharing are and familiarity with its use, and then putting in place the parameters that can negotiate the tricky difference between sort of your restrictions or and then your obligations. So I've really mentioned a lot around limitations and regulations of sharing, and I know that comes up quite a bit. So data sensitivity does not mean that sharing can't occur. It just means that there are restrictions governing your sharing. So you need to understand what your options for sharing are, what the regulations around your data are, and then how to use a data sharing agreement. A lot of this material I've covered in the data management plans presentation that's now available on our YouTube channel. So if you want further more information about this, please consult that. Or we also have the upcoming data management plan seminar that I certainly welcome you to attend. So when you can't share, because that happens a lot, you may not necessarily understand what those parameters might be. So if you don't hold the IP rights, so for example, you've gone into sort of a partnership with a commercial industry funder, the study participants have expressed preference on not how to use their data for shared or secondary use. And this is really important. Again, this is kind of alluded to in the data management plan presentation, but it's really important that your consent form include consent for secondary use around the data that is produced from that research project. And if you haven't done that, then really you can't have the ability to share that data. And that goes for secondary use on your part as well as anyone else. The data embargoed or otherwise restricted by under pre-existing agreements. So again, if you've entered into an agreement through a government or other sorts of jurisdictions, it has, around de-identification, it cannot be adequately de-identified or other kinds of issues that may restrict your ability to share. And then of course, if your data is involved in litigation. So publishing and deposit, a lot of publishers are now offering Creative Commons licenses for your articles. And so what they're doing is that if you go, for example, for a gold option, you will get a more open license. And this is part of the reason why you're here today, is to learn what those license options are, which is really important because it will influence your decision around whether you go for a gold option or a green option. If you go for the more standard or non-green option open, a more restrictive Creative Commons license will be applied. And this may impede your ability to do certain things with either the manuscript or the data. So you really have to understand the implications of your choice, probably in ways now more than ever. And the publisher is also stipulating data deposit as a condition of being accepted or considered example plus, which I've already highlighted in a previous slide. So before we go on to licensing and sort of how to apply a license to your data, it's really important to understand the data lifecycle. And I've kind of alluded to that already when I've referred to the data management plans seminar. So as you can see here, this is sort of the global view of a data lifecycle. And if you haven't sort of done some of these pieces before, or you've kind of decided to sort of take your project sort of as it flows, which is completely understandable. This sort of global view of a data lifecycle you may not have sort of looked at before, but it's really important to think about when you're at the proposal stage or data collection stage of your research, to start to sort of understand the end game and understand, again, planning for reuse, planning for how you're going to share, what data you're going to share, how you're going to share it. So to indicate your sharing, and this is sort of my final wrap up before Althea sort of takes over here to discuss creative licensing in more detail. To indicate that you are sharing or willing to share in your manuscript, publishers are usually requesting 2 steps from you. First of all is to provide a statement in the body of the manuscript that your data in whatever shape or form that you are sharing it in is available. So here's 2 examples of statements that you could sort of indicate that statement of sharing. And then the second step is to provide a citation linking to your data set that is available in a repository. And I really emphasize repositories as opposed to other forms of sharing or publishing, because that is the only accepted version of sharing that either funders or publishers recognize. So you can see here, this is the Vancouver style and then APA style. Of course, this format of data citing will obviously have to be accommodated with the style that you are using in the journal that you're submitting to. And the format and style for data sets hasn't really sort of been pinned down by NISO as of yet. So this is sort of just best practices in terms of how to design that particular citation. So I'm just going to launch our second poll, just to get, again, you thinking, making sure that you're paying attention. So have you ever seen a Creative Commons license? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to answer that. It looks like everyone has answered, so I'm going to close in 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to share the results. Okay, so about 50-50, it looks like yes, or it looks like actually not 50-50, it looks like third. All right, so with that, now Althea's got some information from our audience here about knowledge around Creative Commons. So we're gonna go ahead and turn it over to Althea.
Great, thank you. And this is interesting because I'm hoping when you come away from this, you definitely will know what a Creative Commons license is and have ideas about exactly how to use it. So I'm going to start a bit about data and copyright, because although we do use these licenses with data, they're sort of strange bedfellows, because copyright law views data in terms of ideas, facts, algorithms, and equations differently than expressions of data. So raw data itself is generally viewed as something that's not copyright protectable. And the idea under copyright law is really that no one should get to own a fact. But the way that you've expressed data, so you've put it in a database, it's in a figure or graph, or the way you've analyzed it in an article, that does have copyright protection. So although, as I say, we can use these licenses with data, they fit in some ways a little better with the way that data is expressed in something like an article. So the other thing just to be aware of with data and copyright is that copyright can prevent you from doing certain things with data. So let's say you wanted to extract data from articles, and to do that, you needed to reproduce many copies of them. Maybe copyright lets you do that, maybe it doesn't. Things like scraping data from websites, again, there could be copyright implications. So we need to think of, even though data is not copyright protected, copyright can have an impact because of those expressions. And I'll just give you one quick exception to what I've just said, the exception that proves the rule. There was recently a case that said seismic data, because it uses such specialized knowledge and tools to extract the data, it could have copyright protection. So we might see this shifting a bit in future. And we can go forward now. So what we're talking about with these open licenses, let's get into those. These licenses, they don't take away copyright. We need to think of them as a tool that works with copyright. There's something a creator can put on their work so they tell others how they can use them. And usually the licenses will have some conditions attached to the use as well. We're going to focus on a few of these licenses more closely. We'll start with COVID-19, then we'll get deeper into Creative Commons and give you some information about the Open Government license. You might find on some works that they're original licenses. Someone could have just written out a statement saying you can use this in certain ways, or you might find no license, especially something like US federal government, because they generally view US federal government works as in the public domain. They might not even think to say you can use this freely because they assume people know it. And the other thing I want us just to have an impression of is that we need to think of these licenses as like little contracts or agreements. If you follow the conditions, you're good to go. You're following the terms of the contract. So next slide, please. So we'll look at the Open COVID, the COVID-19 license. This is obviously very new. If you're doing any COVID research, this is something to keep in mind. This was created by an ad hoc team of lawyers and industry specialists, and you'll find a lot of big tech, so Microsoft, Facebook, they're all signing on to this licensing. But it basically gives you very broad rights to do things like use copyright protected works and the data that's in it, for things like manufacturing, creating new, creating new research, making derivative work. So that's taking that work and building upon it to make something new. There are 3 different licenses. The last one here is specific to patents, but the first 2 are about copyright as well. And really the difference between the 2 is just when they terminate. So one is going to be 1 year after the World Health Organization declares an end to COVID-19, and the next one will be January 1st, 2023, or when the pandemic has been declared over by the WHO. And these may be extended. We'll hope they don't have to extend it, but they may be extended. The other thing just to note is you might find some different industry players making their own compatible licenses. For example, Intel has created their own COVID license. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So now we'll move on to Creative Commons. This is the license that you're most likely to see with data or in academic publications. Creative Commons is an organization which is dedicated to sharing knowledge. They've created a series of 6 legal licenses, as well as a public domain option that allow creators to signal how their works can be reused. They give automatic permission, which is great. They also have a license picker. This graphic is sort of referring to that, and it shows you too how you can choose to share your work. So next slide, please. We will start with this license. This is the CC BY, Creative Commons Attribution. When you see by, that means that attribution must be given. As you can see, there's a graphical representation of what the Creative Commons license looks like. There's also sort of a shorthand and then the longer hand. This by, the little person in a circle, this is the building block, the basic building block of a Creative Commons license. You will find this on all of them except the public domain option. And what it basically means is that you must give attribution to the creator when you see this. You can freely reuse the work, you can remix it, modify it, but you must attribute. And you have to indicate if you've made any changes. So this may be the most compatible license to use with data other than the CC0, which is public domain, because it does say it's open, it's reusable, but you have to give credit. So that's the reason a lot of people like this license with data. It's not putting any restrictions really on the user, but we are making sure that there will be citation. And many organizations, like the Public Library of Science, will encourage no more restrictive licensing than this Creative Commons Attribution license. Figshare would meet the principle of this because they do allow you to use this license. And then if we're looking at the bottom of this page, there's also the second component beside the buy. This is non-commercial. This is the money sign crossed out. So when you see this license, it's the same as the attribution license, but now we have one additional aspect, and that's that you can't make any financial gain off of using a work that's licensed under the non-commercial version. So for example, if you wanted to use someone else's data set in a article that you were going to publish in a commercial academic publisher, you may have to go back and get permission from the person who created that data, because this Creative Commons license only lets you use it for non-commercial purposes. As soon as there might be any aspect of commercial gain, the license won't apply. We can move to the next slide. And this is just to give you an idea. And this, I think, really helps show that distinction between copyright licensing for something like an article, that expression, versus data sets or metadata. So for example, in Figshare, if we have any figures, so those are more the expressions of ideas, the thing that attaches copyright, you've got to use something like CC BY, so just the attribution. But if they're talking about raw data, they're saying for data sets, metadata, they want you to use a public domain option. So both of these, people can reuse things freely. One has the attribution requirement, but of course, even without an attribution requirement, for ethical reasons, we should be citing our data. We can move to the next slide. So here is the next Creative Commons license. So this, we can see we've built on our BY Creative Commons license again, and we now have Sharealike. And this is the little arrow in a circle. So when you see that, that means you need to share alike. So this is, again, a very broad license. You can reuse anything under this license, remix it, make something new. You have to give attribution, say if you made any changes. But the other thing about this license is that you must also release it under the same Sharealike license. You've been able to use the material, others should be able to use it under the same license. So Sharealike means share alike. In most cases, if you do have open data obligations, you're going to find that this license is compliant because you're letting people reuse things, even if you are putting on an obligation that they also let others reuse it. You have to be a bit careful though when you're looking at the Sharealike license. And the reason for this is that it is infectious or contagious. If you use data with a Sharealike license and combine it with other data, such as proprietary data, maybe something that you're not able to share or only able to share in certain situations, by combining it together, you're saying, I will let others use this under the Sharealike license. So that's something to be really cautious about. Sharealike license is probably better with data that you already know is openly available and accessible. And the other thing to remember too is just that we have that non-commercial aspect again. So if you see something with non-commercial, just make sure we're not using it in something like an academic publication. So we can move on to the next license. And this is the NoDerivatives. This one is the one with the equal sign. Think of the equal sign meaning you can share things in its integrity. It has to equal what it originally looked like. So often we think of this license as being one where we can share, but it's questionable how much we can remix or reuse. This is definitely the most complicated, the most restrictive of the licenses, particularly when we've got that non-commercial aspect. But it's a little confusing with data because, as I've said, data is not copyright protected, just the expression of data is. So does that mean if you look at someone's article, it's under a NoDerivatives license, but they have a table in there and you'd like to use that data, does this put a restriction on you? Some people think it does. Some people think it doesn't. There's a bit of dispute right now about this. People have different impressions of what exactly this license means and how locked down things become. So I would just urge, when you see this NoDerivatives, flag that as something you should be a bit cautious about. It might even be something where you want to go back to the person who produced the data and just say, I notice this is NoDerivatives. I want to make sure I'm complying with it in the way you understand it. And it's something where if you're supposed to be making your data reusable, I would suggest staying away from the NoDerivatives license again, because there's this idea that people are supposed to only share things in their integrity, and it's a little confusing right now still what that means when we use it on data. So I think we can advance to the next slide. And here is the Creative Commons 0, the public domain option. And this license, a lot of people will say, is the most compatible with data. And the reason is because it's just saying you can use this freely. I am making this available to the public to be used, remixed, etc. There's no real restrictions on something when it has this license. It doesn't make you attribute for ethical reasons. We're going to cite, of course, but the license itself is not going to make you do that. The thing about the license, and you might go, well, if data is already not copyright protectable, you know, do I need this license? But the thing about using the license that's nice is that you're signifying to other people that they can reuse your data. So you're not going to have people worrying about restrictions, IP restrictions, etc. You're not going to have people necessarily contacting you saying, can I use this data? Because you've already made that really clear. They are permitted to use it. So that's one reason that this license is really suggested when you're using data. And you'll find Biomed Central, for example, will say that all data should be a CC0, unless for some reason otherwise noted. Of course, there might be times there are restrictions needed. And Dryad is also an example of a repository that mandates use of this license. I think we can move to the next slide. Thanks. So here's just an example. Let's say you found something under a Creative Commons license. You want to use it, your use fits that license. How do you make sure you're attributing in a way that's going to fit the terms of the license? Because as I've said, these are like little contracts. We want to make sure that we're following them to the best of our ability. So what Creative Commons suggests is that you follow the TASL standard: title, attribution, source, and then the license. So in this case, I have the title of the work, and I always suggest put a link back to where you got things from, because that way someone else can find it really easily. And that's part of Creative Commons ethos, that we should be sharing things. So I have the title of this work that I'm going to be reproducing data from. I have where I found it, the European Data Portal, who it's by, and then also the license that it's available under. And it's important to put that license whenever you're doing an attribution under a Creative Commons license, so that someone else can go back to it. They can see the terms that you used it under. They can know how they're also allowed to use it. So this is an ideal citation for Creative Commons purposes. Of course, you might have another style guides that you use. That's perfectly fine. Most of this is probably going to be something that you're going to have to put just based on that style guide. Just make sure you have these components in any sort of citations you're doing. Go to the next slide. Thanks. So what if you have said, you know, I'm sold on this, Creative Commons is great, or you just have an obligation, maybe you need to use a Creative Commons license. How do you pick it? So one thing you might want to do is choose a license using Creative Commons Choose a License tool. It's pretty simple to go through. If you have any questions about it, if you go, well, I'm really not quite sure about the license, You can always contact me in the Copyright Office. We can talk through this a bit more, but the license picker is pretty nice. It gives you some pretty simple options about how you'd like to share. Do you want people to be able to modify your work, that kind of thing. And then once you've picked that license, you have it. It's, again, very simple to apply this to your work as well. I would still suggest put a copyright statement because, as I said, Creative Commons licenses, they work with copyright. They build on that, but you can put your the copyright symbol, the year, your name, then the license you've chosen, use the graphic, say what the work is licensed under, and then a link back so someone else can read the terms of the license. So let's move to the next slide. Here's another license that you might find more and more. It's fairly recent. I think probably the past year and a half or so it's been around, the Open Government License for Canada. It's quite liberal. You can use data worldwide for free, forever, even for commercial purposes. You are able to copy, modify, translate, adapt, distribute the information for any legal purpose. The only real conditions that you have to acknowledge the source with an attribution statement specified from the information provider. So that might be different depending on what department it is in the government. But let's say there isn't something that's very clearly telling you what the information provider wants you to put. You can just put this statement that it contains information licensed under the Open Government License, or if the attribution is not practical for some reason. So it's a pretty simple license to use. It only applies to copyright protected information. So just if you find trademarks, patent stuff that the government has created, just know this license won't necessarily apply to that, and also not to reuse of personal information. So I think we'll have to see how that goes and what might sort of get locked out of this because it's considered to be personal information. I just want to point out on your handout, we also have information about a couple of other kinds of open licenses. Open Data Commons, that's specifically about databases, and you'll also find out about open source licenses, which is specifically about software or code. And now we'll talk about license stacking and compatibility, because these are other issues that come when you are using open licenses. One thing to keep in mind is that you can apply more than one license to a work. The Creative Commons licenses are open licenses, so that's a license you're giving to the world. You're saying everybody can use this in this way. But let's say you've said non-commercial use. I'm okay with everybody using this as long as I get attribution for non-commercial purposes. But then somebody says, I would really like to write a book. I want to use your data as one of my resources. They can still come to you and say, you know, will you give me permission to do this in a commercial way? So you could say to someone specifically, I will give you a different license than the Creative Commons license. The Creative Commons license won't stop you from doing that. So you might find that you have situations where there are different licenses to different people because the Creative Commons license won't work well. So for example, here I've said, what if you have a Sharealike license and someone wants to use the data in a commercial application and they're worried if they do that, oh my gosh, now they've made their commercial products Sharealike. So they might want a separate license, and that's something that a creator can choose to do. You might also have different licenses that you apply to the same thing. You could use a Creative Commons license as well as an Open Data Commons license. Open Data Commons specific to databases, but you might say, I want to explain how you can use this both as a database and just generally under Creative Commons. And I have said, sort of brought this up already, be careful with any Sharealike licenses because they are infectious. You want to make sure you're not using it with data that you don't want to make open for whatever reason. And also remember, they are really not compatible with the NoDerivatives. We do not want to put those two together. And we want to make sure we're not taking things that can only be used non-commercially and then using a commercial license on them. So we don't want to use CC BY NC and then put it under just a BY license. That would be problematic. The Open Government license, that's going to be fairly compatible with a lot of these other licenses you can probably see, but remember we want to link to the license, attribute the information provider. And then the other thing, and I think this is probably apparent now, you want to think of the compatibility of your licenses on publications and data deposit. So there might be differences. You might be doing data deposit under a CC0, whereas your actual publication, maybe it's a Sharealike or something like that. So those are all things to think about when we're thinking about how these licenses go together. Yeah, I think that that is probably it for me if we want to move on to questions.
Okay, we have 2 questions in the question box, and then if people want to ask questions of us just sort of verbally, I'm happy if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can go ahead and ask. So one question that we've received is, would it be possible to get a copy of a consent form that has sections built into it to allow this? The answer to that would be, I don't have any particular example of a consent form that would have um, language around secondary use data, but it would be lovely to work with a researcher to develop such an example, even as a part of maybe a DMP exemplar that we're looking to build. But no, we do not have a consent form per se that is either a template or an example. Um, I know that Portage is working on trying to get some assistance in language in helping people sort of build in that secondary use language into consent. Second question, are government museum collections expected to be protected under the new open government license? Althea, gonna put that over to you.
Sure. You know, that's a good question. I think it will depend. I mean, first off, it probably would only apply to digitized collections. That would be my first thought. So it would depend on that. And then I think you'd have to see whether or not, for example, I don't know, maybe Libraries and Archives Canada, whether or not they're applying this license, because it is very different department to department. So it's a good question. I'm not sure I have a full answer to it, but I think it's something to look for in future because it might apply.
So those are the only 2 questions that have been submitted. And James Plowman has put a response in regards to the consent that Carrie Hayes, who's the contract officer for the University of Manitoba, had sent some consent form language from the VPRO office around April 1st. And so happy to track that down, or if you want to track that down, that would be great. She had sent it out to the human ethics coordinators. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions or no hands up or in the chat, I think we can safely conclude this presentation. So I thank you for coming. I hope everyone got a copy of the handout, and this recording will be available on the library's YouTube channel. You can certainly contact me if you are wanting a copy of these slides just without the recording, just a copy of the slides, happy to provide them. Otherwise, thanks for attending. I hope you found this valuable, and have a great day.